tell you already, I'm going to tell you again. Legends never die. So you ask for more, you're getting more. On the dance floor, Soca Love Song, part 3. Come again.
Love songs are back.
Oh yes.
Soca love songs are back again.
Come again.
Reggae love songs are back. Reggae love songs are back again.
Sing it.
Thought I was in love before, till you moved in next door with your blue eyes, pretty blue eyes.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Saw you from my window.
Oh, so now watch me.
My heart skipped a beat. Gonna sit by your doorstep.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start. We're running slightly late. Can I first ask you please to switch your mobile phones off or make sure they're on silent or vibrate if you're expecting a call. Thank you. Okay, High Commissioner, Mr. Hugh Arthur, OBE, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to the NCBA debate titled Barbadian Diaspora, Past, Present and Future. To introduce myself, my name is Maureen Stewart and I'm Secretary of BOCFA, which is a Barbados Overseas Community and Friends Association, and it's one of the longest existing Baton associations in the UK. The event is being co-sponsored by the NCBA and the High Commissioner and the High Commission. And the NCBA is the umbrella organization of the various Barbadian associations, both in London and across the UK in the various regions. And they're co-sponsoring this debate this evening. I'm not going to say a lot more since you're not here to hear me, so without much further ado, can I please welcome the High Commissioner, who is going to make a few remarks.
Thank you very much and good evening. And my remarks are going to be very few indeed because we've lost a bit of time and we have a very distinguished panel of presenters who would need to have maximum time to engage with you. But I have to express, firstly, it's good to see so many of you here, especially so many younger people. That's really wonderful. To express thanks to the NCBA for, again, organizing this event as part of the Independence season activities in recognition of our 45th anniversary. I'm going to have to ask your indulgence because I have to rush off to an important, look after an important activity, so I'll step away quietly afterwards. I've explained to Mr. Roach and Ms. Stewart the reasons why. We had the opportunity this year to visit most of the regions where there are diaspora organizations. I was myself able to visit the associations in Manchester and Leicester and Leeds, and other members of the mission, the Deputy High Commissioner, Mr. Councillor, and so on, visited in Birmingham and Reading and Bristol and Coventry. And the message was that we're trying to give substance to the policy of the government to engage the diaspora in a more meaningful way. I gave the undertaking to those areas where I visited that early in the new year I would seek to return to have some discussion with them on how we can shape a practical and meaningful diaspora diplomacy program. And I want to invite your participation in helping us in the mission articulate a meaningful program that speaks to what it is we need to do for our diaspora community in the United Kingdom. What are the programs that we need to develop that would engage the younger people in particular, especially because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has announced that we will be having the second diaspora consultation in Barbados in August next year, and the focus of that consultation will be the youth in the diaspora. But there are a number of things that we need to discuss about how we can give substance to the notion of engaging the diaspora in a meaningful way. And I hope the discussion this evening will perhaps set a platform for our advancing that agenda in the new year. It's lovely to see all of you, and thank you all very much for coming out, and thank our partners in the NCBA for organizing the event. Thank you very much.
Your chairman for this evening's proceedings will be Tyrone Roach, who I'm sure needs no introduction. I'm sure he's very familiar to the majority of you. So without further ado, Tyrone Roach, your chair for the evening.
Thank you very much, Maureen. It's like the others have said, it's a glad sight to see so many people in the hall tonight, and we hope we manage to educate and stimulate. May I now introduce the presenters. My far left is Hal Austin, who's a financial journalist, a journalist on the Financial Times. Alan Smith from HSBC, he is a banker, and he's the head of global strategy. I should have started with a lady, and I do apologize, because I know you were going to say it. Vanessa Denny, she works in housing, and she's a development worker in the housing sector. And last but not least, Professor Richard Drayton, who's going to kick off things with us. He's a professor of history at King's College and an ex-Harrisonian, I do believe, along with Alan. And I have to say this, Alan Smith is Harrisonian, and Hal Austin is representing Combermere, just in case you... Professor Richard Drayton, please.
Good evening. It's a very great pleasure to be here to share fish cakes and conkeys with you for one more year. I'm looking out into the crowd and seeing some familiar faces, either from last year or from Birmingham this summer. I am supposed to speak to you for 10 minutes, and I'll try to police that very carefully, because we have some far more interesting people to speak after me about the past of the Barbadian diaspora. Now, the experience of diaspora, by which we mean the experience of a community being scattered over space, separated between 2 or 3 or many places, has been central to the experience of Barbados from the very beginning. First, this island was an island which was peopled by people who were brought without their consent from places from Senegambia down to Angola, and who had to find a new way of making a home for themselves in that island over the first 200 years of its history. But after emancipation, the experience of diaspora, in this case a diaspora of emigration, became even more central to the Barbadian experience. Because the way in which the planters in Barbados managed emancipation was to ensure that they maintained the maximum command over labor by placing labor in as insecure a position as possible. This involved, for example, the tenantry system, whereby people's housing depended on the tolerance and grace and willingness of the employer. This depended on the vagrancy laws, which penalized those who were not seen to be working when there was work to be done on the plantations. The consequence of this is that the experience of post-emancipation Barbados was that working people found themselves, in fact, being screwed into tighter and tighter conditions. Indeed, when emancipation happens in 1838, wages are $1 a day for agricultural laborers. In the 1890s, they are crunched down to 9 pence a day. When the 1937 riots happen, the Moyne Commission sent out to investigate discovers that the wages of field workers are $1 a day. They had not changed in the 100 years from emancipation through to the 1930s. That's remarkable. Now, how was that sustainable? Well, that was sustainable through migration. Essentially, Barbadians, to survive that system, migrated from the 1840s and 50s, and every decade after that. They migrated to British Guyana, where there was a demand for labor. They migrated to Brazil, and of course they migrated in very large numbers to Panama at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Not only Panama, they worked in the banana plantations in Costa Rica. They worked in the sugar plantations in Cuba. And so there was a whole kind of intra-Caribbean diaspora of Barbadians emerging already by the early 20th century. Then they began to go further afield. And if we look at the West Indians who were in New York in 1920, there are more Barbadians than people from any other place. There's estimated something like 3,000 or 4,000 Barbadians out compared to 3,000 Jamaicans. Of course, Jamaicans these days greatly outnumber the Barbadians, but this was not true in 1920. Now, in time, of course, these migrants would come to the United Kingdom, but this was one of the last places, in fact, to receive substantial waves of Barbadian migration. The significance of these diasporas was twofold. The first, most important fact is that these diasporas made possible the economic survival of the society. They took away people who would have starved at home. And these people, once they migrated, became sources of resources which were being sent back to their families. And essentially, from as early as the 1850s and 1860s, there are reports of savings being sent back by Barbadians from abroad. And when we come to the Panama period, we see that the island is transformed by the money which is sent back from Barbadians who build the Panama Canal. So we're talking here about revenues for the island, which were from remittances abroad, which were higher than the combined exports of the island, even in the high era of sugar. So it's not just, in other words, a case of the descendants of slaves surviving on the basis of this subsidy, but the entire economy, the possibility of the colony, depended on these overseas flows, these overseas connections. And of course, these continue to today. Barbadians, like people from all over the Caribbean, remain very generous in terms of sending back resources for family who remain at home. But the other significance of these diasporas was in shaping the kind of political and cultural identity of Barbadians at home. And those of you who go to your local libraries, I suggest you ask your local library to order this book, which came out this July. It is fascinating. It's volume 11 of the Marcus Garvey and UNIA papers. And it's special. It's a volume which is focused on the Caribbean diaspora from 1910 to 1920. This is part of a very great collection of documents done by the Jamaican Robert Hill at University of California, Los Angeles. But what he looks at here is the entire experience of the movements of people within the Caribbean diaspora in that 10-year period. And what we see, and it doesn't surprise us when we think about it, is that the most important factors in the politicization of the 20th century Caribbean, and Barbados within it, are exactly these migrant flows, these people who go abroad and who have different experiences and who come into contact with different kinds of ideas and then who return home. Some of these people we know the names of. So for example, Charles Duncan O'Neill, who we know makes his little diasporic circuit to Britain and then back. But there are many, many people whose names we do not know, who went to places like Panama and Costa Rica and Cuba and returned to Barbados bringing with them ideas of Garveyism, trade unionism, political nationalism. And when it came to the making of political parties and trade unions in the Caribbean in the 1930s and 40s, what we find again and again is that the key figures on the ground were people who were shaped by this migrant experience. People who had been sent home from Cuba in the late 20s and early 30s, and from Costa Rica, when these countries closed their borders to migrants. So in very important ways, the social and political life of Barbados and its cultural life were shaped fundamentally by these experiences of migration, which took people away and often took them back. Well, what has that got to do with us? I think if we were honest, even though in our hearts we say, rather like Jews at Passover next year in Jerusalem, that there will not be many of us who will actually be able to return to Barbados and live there permanently for the rest of their lives. Some people here will be lucky enough to manage it, but the majority of people here will not. And this raises all sorts of questions. Questions about how all the talents and abilities and the love you have for Barbados can be brought to bear for the benefit of that island. Now we have a very difficult situation here because in ways which we're often not candid enough about, there are fundamental problems in every diaspora, not just our own, between those who stayed at home and those who went away. Those who stayed at home think that those who went away are arrogant. They're pushy. They want to tell them what to do. They want to take over things. They're know-it-alls. Whereas those who went away and who come back think that the people there, they only want to rip you off. They want to, the lawyers and the system exist essentially to milk you. There's a sense of resistance of things being unable to be changed, to be moved. And I'd like to think that a lot of this has to do with the kind of innate problems, really, of the context in which the diaspora returns. I wonder what the solution is for this. And my own thinking about this leads me in two kinds of directions. I think that one possibility is that there could be some attempt to structure some kind of system of adult internships where you would know, and they would know, that you were there for just 2 weeks, or 1 month, or 2 months, or 3 months. And in that period of time, you could exchange, and you could give, and you could take, without that sort of anxiety on their part, that you were there in some way to displace them, or to claim some kind of special favor. I do believe that there are many, many of us who, given the opportunity, would be willing to give 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe even more, of our time every year to Barbados. To be there, to talk to people, to work with young people, to transfer skills, to help solve problems. if only in some way there were structures into which we could fit. Now this in part is a problem which we cannot solve from the outside. In part this has to be solved also from at home. But at least we can begin to think about ways in which we could organize ourselves to bring our strength and our abilities, and not just merely our resources, to bear in the interests of Barbados. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Richard. The format of the evening will go like this. All four gentlemen will speak, all four presenters, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Next one up will be Hal Austin, who's going to talk about the future. The present, sorry. Hal is going to do the present. Consider the reasons why the contribution of the diaspora is set to decline and the effect this is likely to have on the economy of Barbados.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fellow Barbadians, I have a funny feeling, I don't know what the other presenters think or what you think, that we've been pigeonholed here tonight. We're talking about being the diaspora, a word I don't particularly like. And the implicit suggestion is that we mustn't talk about Barbados and the mess it's in. But if that's the rule, we must stick to it. The other thing is, given that we're running terribly late, anyone who's interested in the speech that I intended giving, if you give me your email address, I'll send it to you. But I just want to talk briefly. I want to put the awful situation that Barbados is in perspective, because unless there's perspective, context, I don't think that we'll get a full picture. There are two problems here in Barbados as far as the diaspora is concerned. The first one is the talent pool at home and the opportunities and training that those of us who've left Barbados and our children and grandchildren get outside Barbados, mainly in Britain, the United States and Canada. And the other thing really is the drift from Barbados, the brain drain, people that are educated there and who at the earliest opportunity leave the country. But, and those are the two things I think that we got to put in context. The other thing, the fundamental issue, however, is that the world is in a mess. Britain is in a mess, an almost irretrievable economic mess. The Eurozone is in a mess. And we all know this started in the 2007, 2008 with the banking crisis, the housing collapse and so on, which led to the global recession, which led to the sovereign debt crisis, because what governments did all over Europe and North America was to take this debt off the banks, private sector, and put it on the taxpayers, which is the sovereign debt we now experience in Europe, the Eurozone. And the net result, of course, of that is that the mature economies, the Anglo-Saxon economies, are almost in irreversible decline. America, over the next 25, 50 years, will remain the dominant economy. But it would be a much smaller economy than it was at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think we're going to see that certainly in the case of Britain, the nonsense we have, that Britain has some special relationship with the United States and so on. I think we're going to experience over the next 2, 3, 5 years it's really dreaming. America, as Obama has done over the last week or so, had a big trans-Pacific conference, and that's where the United States is looking for its development, the Pacific. We are outside the Eurozone, as you well know, and as the various leaders in Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, have been telling David Cameron, stop preaching at us, and basically, either join or shut up. And that's what they've been telling the British. So basically, that's the international, the very broad international picture. Now, in terms of Barbados, we all love Barbados. Those of us who've lived there, certainly in my case, who was born and educated there. But there's also a great myth that many Barbadians share, and that I, certainly not being controversial, I'm not controversial, I have not. the nonsense, for example, that Barbados is a developed nation, and the nonsense that we have 99.9% literacy, and so on. They're myths. The reality is that some of our best educated people coming out of KFL, are functionally semi-literate. We're talking about a community that, in a globe where we have just had the greatest economic expansion in human history. That's what we've had since 1980 up until 2007, when we had the global crisis. And we cannot see, or I certainly can't, my glasses aren't that bad, any prosperity coming out of this global growth in Barbados. What we've seen, is a hell of a lot of building on the West Coast. Properties going 15 million, 70 million, whatever. We've seen in the middle of the country, we've seen lots of middle class developments and so on. On the West Coast, as we well know, there are lots of Irish people exploiting cheap money around the world and buying into Barbados. There are lots of wealthy footballers and other business people, the Simon Cowells of this world, buying into Barbados and so on. In the middle, we've got a fair number of returnees who've been returning there, selling their properties in Britain, and returning to live in Barbados, and who've been driving the construction sector. But the reality is that most of what we think is prosperity in Barbados has in fact been kids maxing out their credit cards. We've been living on debt, and we have been living on debt ever since independence. Barbadian post-independence development has been debt-ridden. And basically, it's a simple equation. If you earn £10 a week and you spend 11, you're in debt. That's what we've been doing. We import more than we export, and that's the big problem. And to this day, not a single post-independence government has actually come up with any real solutions to these problems. The unfortunate situation of the DLP, which has been borne out for the last 3 years, is that, and I don't need to offend the members of the DLP here, but they don't even seem to understand the extent of the crisis for us to come up with a solution for it. And that's the real problem. I just want to give you some figures, and I don't want to drown you with figures because I think that that the truth will out really. Since in 2006, the eve of the global crisis, global financial assets stood at something like 167 trillion, which is serious money. It's kind of money we never heard about when we were kids. And that was an increase of something like 25 trillion on the previous year. I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, that most of that growth really came from depreciation of the American dollar. And what that means in real terms for us is that the Barbados dollar being paid to the American dollar, we have people like Bernanke determining our monetary policy. We have no say in that, and that's the reality. Yeah. You'll ask why that's why having this pegging, and I've always said, those of you who I've spoken to over the last few years, why pegging the Barbados dollar to the greenback is economically reckless. And for the reason I've just said, it means that we have no control. We cannot devalue our dollar, for example, if we want to attract more tourists to the country, and I'm not a big fan of tourism as the main driver of the economy. It means that we can't make key decisions about monetary policy. We have to depend on what's coming out of Washington. It means that that we say silly things like what the governor of the central bank said recently, that Barbados, it's a good thing for Barbados not to have any homegrown banks, because the banks, and he was speaking about Canada in this particular instance, the Canadian regulated banks, much better regulated and much better managed than anything we can do in Barbados. On the other hand, he also said on another occasion that we have the best regulatory system in the world. So I can't work out exactly what he means. I get the impression he was giving the audience he was speaking to at a particular time what they were looking for. But it's also interesting, I think, in the light of the patchwork monetary policies that we have in Barbados, that despite the last 3 years or so of serious economic meltdown around the world, around the developed world, that something like $700 trillion are still swishing around within global economies. Again, I don't know about you, but I just came back from Barbados in October, and I haven't seen any sense whatsoever that any of this global wealth is actually reaching Barbados. And I think, again, that that's the paucity of